Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Career Cafe website webinar for today. My name is Kate Alder, and I'm with you. I'm coming to you from Irvine Valley College, and I'm the tech support and helping to host the webinar for today. So you should be seeing on your screen right now a slide that describes some information about how to listen to the webinar via computer speakers or headset. All of your microphones, if you do have them, will be muted during the entire webinar. And what we'll do is we'll use the chat window or the questions window that you should be seeing on the right side of your screen now. So you'll be able to type in your questions if you have any, and I'll be monitoring the questions throughout the entire webinar. So when you have questions, please feel free to type them in there. If it's a tech question, I'll respond just to you. If it's a question for Kate Brooks, then I will just be hanging on to those questions and providing them to her at the end of the webinar. So if you have questions during the webinar for Kate Brooks, please just write them in the question area, and then we'll be monitoring those as we come along. So I see several people have already logged in. I'm going to give it just another moment or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. So again, if you have any questions, please just type them in the questions or in the chat area on your screen.
Hi, ladies, I'm here.
Hi, Rita. Glad that you were able to join us. I just saw your text, too. So,
yeah, if you don't mind, I'm coughing. I just feel really crappy. If you would do it, it would be great, Kate. I'd appreciate it.
Okay, we'll do that then. Thanks,
Okay,
Rita.
thanks.
And I hope you feel better soon.
Thanks.
Okay, folks, out of respect to everybody's time, it's about 2 or 3 minutes after noon, so I do want to go ahead and get started. Again, this is Kate Alder with Irvine Valley College. Hopefully you're seeing on your screen right now the information about where you'll be able to find the recording of this webinar. So the Career Development Advisory Committee webpage on the California Career Briefs website is where you'll find the recording of this and all of our previous and future webinars that have been brought to you by the Career Cafe. Also, don't forget about all the other great resources for students, the Career Cafe, for professionals, career briefs. And if you haven't already done so, please remember to join the Ning social network at cacareercafe.ning.com. It's a great place to share your ideas and learn from your colleagues around the state of California about what's working for them in working with our students. So now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to the webinar. Some of you may have already heard Rita Jones just joined us a minute ago, and she's not feeling too well today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to Dr. Katharine Brooks, Kate Brooks. If you haven't had the pleasure of hearing Kate before, she's actually been a real treat to work with, and I've participated in her webinars last year and this year, and it's really been a pleasure. Please try to listen as fully as you can and see the difference it makes in the quality of your experience. I know it's kind of hard. We tend to multitask. So do yourself a favor, turn off your email, turn everything else off, and just give yourself an hour to really get absorbed in this and learn as much as you can. So Kate's been asked to join us in this grant project because she's a real leader in combining her expertise in working with college students in the traditional career development sense, but also effectively helping them prepare for the real world of work. So today's topic is going to be dealing with quiet clients, the introvert in the job search. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kate Brooks now. So if you give me a second here. And Kate, are you there?
I am. And
okay.
Is that working?
And we are seeing your screen, I believe, yes.
Okay, the job searching for introverts?
Yes, we are. Okay, great. Thank you.
Good.
Go ahead, Kate.
All right, so I think we're ready to go here. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and I'm really glad to do this program. I should start with a confession. I am an introvert, so this topic is particularly interesting to me, and I've always found the whole topic of introversion kind of puzzling and a little bit confusing because there's so many myths out there and misconceptions, misinformation about it. And I have found that even though I'm an introvert, I find it hard to work sometimes with introverts because they can present challenges, particularly in the job search area. And so the purpose of this today is to maybe give you some tips, some ideas, places to go. There's some wonderful books and resources out there that I'm going to bring up. And I just encourage you to be creative. If you yourselves are introverts, you know, think about where your strengths are and how you can apply this knowledge. And then also, if you are working with students who are having trouble in the job search and you suspect that it might be because of an introverted nature, providing them with information and guidance can be really helpful. So on that note, I want to start with the kind of the
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy. Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an organizer and may now speak to any other organizers or panelists on the line. When you are ready to begin the presentation, press the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast.
Into, meaning, do I need to be an extrovert? I'm not really an extrovert. I don't want to be an extrovert. And so students get kind of turned off by the phoniness of the job search. And so that's the question that I really hear a lot and I want to get back to throughout this program is, do I have to be different? The first thing I want to start with, though, is the definition of what is an introvert. And the first thing to keep in mind, there really isn't any one self. We are all various selves that we change depending on our situation. Most of us are not so fixed that we are reacting exactly the same way in all situations. And that applies to whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. And we change, we adapt because that's part of how we survive in society. We read the cues and we learn when there's a place that we need to be quiet, and we learn when there's a place where we need to speak up or we need to be more active. And if we're socially adept, we do that. So there isn't any one self, and no one is on an extreme of always extroverted or always introverted. There are times when extroverted people exhibit characteristics of introverts and vice versa. So what is introversion? Well, I think this is one of these things that social psychologists fight all the time. If you get into the social psych research, it's just amazing how nudgy they get about the definitions of what is an introvert versus a shy person versus someone with social anxiety. And I've written several blog posts about introversion, and I can tell you that not only are they pretty much my most highly read blog posts, and I think that's because so many introverts are on the internet, but also they get the most snarky comments sometimes about, well, you didn't really define that very well, did you? And it's just kind of interesting. It's very controversial. So I am going with the definition that is in a book, a wonderful book called Quiet by Susan Cain, C-A-I-N. And if you haven't seen or read that book, I really can't recommend it enough. It's just excellent. She defines introversion as basically an inward orientation toward life. It's a preference that we have, and it's a source of energy. The energy comes from internal sources. It comes from ourselves and ideas. And it's also a preference for a less overstimulating environment. That's a key characteristic of introverts. They don't generally like overstimulating environments. And of course, there's always a continuum of what is understimulating to what is overstimulating. Shyness, on the other hand, is more of a fear-based situation. Introversion's not fear-based. It's just a preference. Shyness is more fear-based, and usually it's based on, I'm afraid that someone's going to disapprove of me, or I will be humiliated in some way. And it's an inherently painful process. Introversion isn't necessarily painful. So shyness is very much a different mental state. And then social anxiety is, again, on this continuum. It's a pretty chronic and disabling type of shyness. So someone who has social anxiety is really experiencing a debilitating situation. I would argue that if you have clients who are in that extreme, getting towards that shyness and certainly into social anxiety, that's a good place to refer or team up with somebody from a counseling center or a psychologist. I think those things are going to require more in-depth tackling than most of us have time to do in a usual career center setting. The introversion situation can be worked with. Social anxiety can be worked with, and certainly there are ways to help someone, but it usually, again, is more intense, and you may want to refer. So one of the things I find kind of interesting is the studies and the research now that they're doing on the physiology. Because cognitive science has come so far in the last 10, 20 years, they're just finding out more and more about how this whole personality thing interplays and how it works in our brain. And so one of the studies that Susan Cain mentions in her book Quiet is a longitudinal study that was done for, obviously many, many years, as longitudinal studies are, on individuals to see how much they react to situations. And it started with the group, the people in the study, when they were infants. I believe they were only about 12 weeks old. And they had these little 12-week-old infants, and they did things like make loud noises next to them, or they would turn music up loud, or a television set, or they would have bright lights. They did various things, and they'd have faces, people's faces in them. So what they discovered was that some babies, when this would happen, would just be there. They just wouldn't necessarily react. Whatever. They called them basically low reactive individuals. And then there were other babies that would start moving. They'd move their arms and legs. They'd clearly get excited, agitated, active, whatever you might say, when this noise and all this stimulus was around. And originally, they kind of hypothesized that maybe those babies that were moving around and getting excited, those were extroverts because they were, getting into the environment. And maybe the introverts were the quiet ones that were sitting there. And what they learned, because they followed these babies over a long period of time, what they learned was just the opposite. That the babies that reacted strongly to the stimulus were much more likely, very high percentage, to be introverted. And so that just became kind of an interesting focus of research, and they discovered that introverted people are often what they call high reactors, meaning when there's a stimulus in the situation, it hits them harder. It makes them more aware, potentially more agitated, more stressed, or just maybe overwhelmed. So, and it fits when you think about an introverted person walking into a party scene where there's a noise and loud music and all of that versus an extrovert. Extroverts kind of go in and they just sort of roll with that. And introverts generally, and again, I realize I'm broadly stereotyping here, and so we need to remember that this is a continuum, but many introverts do not like that kind of overstimulated environment, or they may like it for a little while and then they get tired and they're ready to leave. They also discovered that introvert brains are generally busier than extrovert brains. There's a lot more activity going on in them. And there's also an interplay between temperament, sort of what is the temperament I was born with, because that's the thing they discovered. These little low, high reactive infants pretty much stayed consistent throughout their lives. They kept, in this experiment, they kept exposing them to different levels of stimulus, and they continued to either be a low reactive or a high reactive. People did not change. But at the same time, the social psychologists recognized that free will played a role in this, and that we do have some choice, so that our physiology may sort of predispose us to be more introverted or extroverted, but within that spectrum we have the ability to adapt and to make changes. And the example that gets used, for instance, is Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. You know, there's this sort of rubber band theory that we can expand and we can go so far and then it's going to snap back. So you have somebody like Bill Clinton, who's very social and extroverted and, you know, such a great sort of communicator. And then you have Bill Gates, who's brilliant, but very much an introvert and not a good conversationalist necessarily. And, you know, Bill Clinton will never become Bill Gates, and Bill Gates will never be able to be Bill Clinton. But each one of them can develop this other part of their personality. And then finally, one of the real interesting findings in terms of the physiology of this is we have these parts of our brain, and toward the back of our brain there's a thing called the amygdala. And the amygdala is part of the limbic system. And it's basically the ancient part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that we have in common with lizards and various other creatures. It's a survival part of the brain. And it's the part of our brain that has kept us alive and our ancestors alive for many, many, many years. It's the warning system. It's the fear response. It's the fight-flight. It's that jolt that you get when you hear a loud noise or when something surprises you, and that's the amygdala going to work. Well, we also have this other part of our brain that came along later in evolution, and it's called the frontal cortex. Sometimes the neocortex is part of that, sometimes called prefrontal cortex. But that part of the brain is the logical part of the brain, and that's the part that helps you make decisions. It helps you set goals. If you're in the grocery store, it's the part that helps you pick out which tube of toothpaste you're going to buy. When you're in that mode, you know, people seldom get too anxious about picking out their toothpaste. It's one of those things, it's a logic thing. You're looking for decision making and you grab the toothpaste and on you go. And it's usually a relatively calm experience. That's what that part of the brain is. And one of the very important aspects of that brain is what we call self-soothing. It's the part of the brain that tells you to calm down, so that in the middle of the night, if there's a loud noise, sudden noise, your amygdala is going to go into fight or flight. Oh my goodness, what's this? I might, you know, wake up suddenly. You react. You get the jolt of adrenaline, and then then your neocortex, your frontal cortex, kicks in, and it says, no, it's windy, and that was just a branch hitting the window. And so immediately, you know, your limbic system just calms right down and says, okay, no problem. Well, that kind of interaction is what's going on all the time in introvert and extrovert, with the introvert having a more active limbic system and needing to develop more of that prefrontal cortex that tells it it's okay to calm down. So you walk into a party, and it's the cortex system that says, okay, reach out your hand, shake the person's hand, and say hello. That's that part of the brain, whereas the amygdala is like, oh, you know, what's going on? So it's very, you know, it's a constant interaction. And the interesting thing is they're starting to discover that we can really build that cortex area, and we can strengthen it. And you can help your clients strengthen it by doing various things, some of which include meditation, things like that. So I kind of like this quote. This was in the book Quiet, and it says, there's only a few people out there who can completely overcome all their fears, and they live in Tibet. I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful idea, that none of us is going to fully recover our fears. And that's a good point to make to someone who is introverted and is fearful or at all worried about the interview. You know, no one's ever going to totally overcome your fears. That's unrealistic to try to do that, but let's get you some training so you're more confident when you go into it. So again, I want to be careful about stereotyping here, but they have identified characteristics of introverts, and they are a diverse group. But introverts in general tend to take more time to process a situation. They also gain energy and power through their own inner reflection. They're very good listeners generally. They get excited by ideas more so than external activities. And when they have to be in a different type, when they have to be more extroverted because the role requires it, they are more susceptible to burning out and getting tired. So an extrovert can go to a party and they may not be the life of the party, and sometimes they can be, but they probably will leave the party earlier than others will. And there's also a high correlation between introversion and creativity. Many, many creative types are also introverts. And they're also very good at complex problem solving. Susan Cain, who I mentioned earlier, I strongly recommend you go to YouTube, and if you type in Susan Cain and you also put in TED Talk, you'll get her TED Talk, which is about a 10-minute talk about her book and about introversion. And she just has these wonderful stories about herself. And the first one that she tells is about her first time going to summer camp. And she had come from a family of readers where their idea of the way to spend an evening together was everybody, her mom, her dad, and her siblings, they all each had a book, and they'd sit in the living room and read their book. And that's how they socialized. So she took all her books to camp and quickly learned that camping really wasn't about books. She thought she was going to be sitting in her cabin reading books with all these other girls. And of course, the first thing they had to do was learn this cheer about let's get rowdy, you know, everybody get rowdy, R-O-W-D-I-E. And one of the things she says is, I just kept looking at her thinking, why do I have to get rowdy? And why do I have to spell it incorrectly? So that's your classic introvert, extrovert kind of collision, and there can be those collisions at times. But I like this particular quote from another book called Introvert Power, where she says, introversion is not defining lack, it's rather a wellspring of riches. So that's the reason I want to talk for a minute about kind of the myths about introversion. One myth is that somehow it's a disappointing personality characteristic, you know, and I think that people hear that sometimes, particularly introverts. Why can't you be more outgoing? There's the classic introvert-extrovert conflict where the extrovert says, why didn't you tell me? And the introvert says, why didn't you ask? You know, there's this notion that somehow an introverted personality is less than. There's also, which of course is a myth, there's also this myth that they're minorities. For a long time we had this belief that introverts made up about 30% of the population, and so therefore in the United States, therefore we were in the minority. And what the latest research seems to show is that number came from back when they were with the Myers-Briggs, and it was years ago when they were norming the test. Actually, it's about at least 50%, arguably even a little bit more, of the United States has an introverted personality. But nobody believes that. So as a result, introverts feel like I'm always in the minority. They're actually not. There's also that myth that they're somehow an antisocial hermit. They are not. Antisocial is not the opposite of social. Antisocial is a personality disorder. It's a sociopath. And there is no correlation between introvert and antisocial. There also is this myth that they're somehow the kind of incompetent, the nerd, the whatever, and sometimes introverts will call themselves that. And again, introverts can have perfectly well-developed social skills, but at the same time, after they use their perfectly well-developed social skills, they may leave the room for a while. Loners. That's another kind of pejorative term, and I particularly dislike it because it always seems to be attached to whoever just pulled out a gun and committed some violent crime. Well, he was a loner. And so that's a particularly unfortunate tag. The introverts do enjoy being alone, but it doesn't make them loners, and it doesn't make them lonely either. Another is that sometimes they get accused of being sort of a snob or aloof, and it's because they're not, you know, extroverts tend to have their own little world, and they're chatting, and if you picture like a group of soccer moms or something all sitting together watching a game, and you've got several extroverted soccer moms, and then you have an introverted one, the introverted one's probably not entering into the conversation as much. She may be listening, but she's sitting there, and the extroverts will kind of start to think, well, does she not like us? Is this, you know, does she think she's too good for us? You know, that sort of misperception will come out. And then there's also this notion that somehow if you're introverted, you're suffering in some way, that you're not enjoying something. And that happens a lot to introverts. You know, we often pair up with extroverts because extroverts are a lot of fun to be around, and it's not uncommon for extroverts and introverts to be friends and spouses and all that sort of thing because we benefit from each other. And sometimes the extrovert will assume that the introvert is unhappy or not having a good time or suffering in some way. So these are all, you know, it's a myth, but unfortunately it's one that's kind of prevalent. So in terms of challenges, you know, and that's a typo, I apologize, it should say America, the extroverted. You know, there is this perception that the American culture is an extroverted culture, and lots of time it is. When you think about the classic stereotype of the ugly American abroad, it's usually because they're loud and they're, you know, they're kind of noisy and they're in the face of people, and that's very much an extroverted kind of perception, although extroverts have better social skills. Just because they're extroverted doesn't mean they're inappropriate. So also workplaces and jobs tend to be extroverted. You know, there's certain job categories like sales that just lend themselves to extroverted. And, you know, certain fields, in fact, particularly high-paying fields, tend to be extroverted in nature. The challenge is the myths that I mentioned earlier, the fact that, you know, that introverts fight those myths all the time. So they're having to battle with employers and potential hirers who might have these myths about, well, I'm not sure we want to hire a loner. They're not going to fit into our office. And there is a culture of competition within the workplace that can be a challenge as well. And it's not that introverts don't compete. They can be very competitive, but they don't compete necessarily the way an extrovert would compete. It's going to be more quiet. And so the question comes, do we need to give extroversion training to an introvert? And that's something that goes back to that core question of, do I have to be something I'm not? And I would never call it extroversion training, but I would call it how to cope in an extrovert environment, or how to thrive or how to succeed in an extroverted environment, because that's what the job search is. It is, for the most part, an extroverted environment. And another challenge for introverts is they do keep things hidden. Introverts have this amazingly rich interior, but unless you ask, they may not divulge it, and it drives extroverts crazy. So as I mentioned earlier, that constant, why didn't you say something? So some specific challenges at work or in the job search are that they may not be perceived as and they may actually not demonstrate enough energy or enthusiasm when they're in an interview. They may not make as strong eye contact. They may not appear as confident. And introverts need space. They need mental space and physical space. And so when they get in an interview or they get in a tense situation or anything where they've got to respond on the spot, that's usually not their best feature, and they may forget. So it's important when you're working with them to go over and over what are the 3 key things you want that employer to know before you leave the room, with the hope that that will help them do that. They also, the open work environments can be a challenge. If it's a work setting where there's just cubicles and there's no doors and walls and ceilings and things where you can have private space, introverts are notorious for knowing where all the bathrooms are when they finish a presentation or when they are at a party or anything else, because it's the one place they can go and have peace and quiet for a few minutes. That's a great hideout for introverts who are public speakers. They often talk about that they find the bathroom so that they can just hide out for a little bit. And also employers that demand that there is a team approach to everything. And interestingly enough, and I don't have time to go into this, but Susan Cain does in her book Quiet, she brings up a lot of research that shows that the most creative activity doesn't necessarily happen in a team environment, that particularly for introverts, letting them go and be on their own is a much more creative environment. So if you're doing a workshop, you might want to think about giving introverts and giving people a chance to take 5 minutes and write down their ideas rather than necessarily having them speak to one another, or at least have them write down their ideas first and then speak rather than just saying, okay, let's pair up and talk about that. Giving introverts that time and space to think things through is really important. And then another thing is to start instilling in them the power of being an introvert, because again, they're well aware of the myths. And so that rich inner world, you know, they've taken in, they've listened, they've read, they've taken in so much information that their inner world can be very, very full. And making them aware of that and getting them to maybe jot down some ideas about what are some things I really do know a lot about. Where are my strengths? Also, the power of concentration and focus. Introverts are generally very good at concentrating on projects for a while. And now when I say that, it's interesting. Susan Cain said something in her book I found fascinating because it applied to me and I hadn't really thought about it. She said when she was writing her book, being an introvert, she had herself all set up at a private room in her house where her family wouldn't disturb her and she could be all alone and there with the computer and she could just write. And she quickly discovered she couldn't get anything done. She immediately went into writer's block. And what worked for her, and I found this to be true for myself when I was writing, was to go to Starbucks with the computer. Because you're still in your own little world. You're not really interacting. You're not talking to the people coming into Starbucks, but there's something about having people around and having a little bit of noise and hustle or whatever in the background allows you to concentrate better. Now that may not be true for all introverts. There may be some who really need that dead quiet environment, and that again is the thing to just find out how they do their best. And they also get into flow when they're involved with what they call natural work, things that come naturally to them, strengths, skills that they do well. If it's a writer, then they're probably going to get into really good flow when they're writing. If it's public speaking, they'll get into flow when they're doing that. And yes, introverts can be just fine public speakers. Thoughtful. They tend to be very thoughtful people. They tend to be creative. And when they do decide to speak up, people listen. You know, I remember there was that old stockbroking company, I think it was E.F. Hutton or something, and the ad used to be, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen. And Susan Cain has this story when she was trained as a lawyer originally, and when she was doing a mediation, she was in the room with these very volatile parties that were just trying to kind of bully her and go over her, and she said she was so overwhelmed that she just said nothing. And she said nothing for quite a long time until finally she said something like, well, could we find a common ground or something? And that was the only thing she said. And because she hadn't said anything for so long, it had tremendous power, and it sort of changed the meeting. And in fact, one of the firms came up afterward on the opposing side and tried to hire her away. And they complimented her on this wonderful system she had. And she said, I have no system. I just was afraid to say anything, so I just kept my mouth shut. I didn't know what to say. But that's a great example of just the fact that, you know, just sometimes staying quiet carries with it its own power. So this notion of giving students permission to be an introvert, I think, is very important, and we all need that permission, anybody who deals with that. I remember giving a NACE program one time, and I said to the audience, one of the things that happens is people who are at my programs, it's a 2-day training, and at the end of the first day, they often invite me to dinner. And so in the morning, what I tell people right away is I said, you just need to know I'm an introvert. And I said, I love doing this. I love interacting with you. But after a whole day of training, about the last thing I want to do is keep talking. So I am going to go back upstairs to my hotel room. I'm going to get room service, and I'm going to watch reruns of NCIS or something like that. And that's how I'm going to spend my evening, and I will be very, very happy spending my evening that way. But again, it's not that I don't like you. It's just I need my energy back. And it was funny because I just sort of say that every time because I've learned to do that. And someone came up to me the second day of my program, and she wanted to shake my hand, and she said, I just wanted you to know, she said, thank you so much for giving me permission to just do that. She said, I come to these programs and I always feel like everybody wants to go out and everybody wants to do things. And she says, not that I don't want to do it. She said, I just, by the end of an all-day training, I've kind of had enough and I really need time alone. And she said, I've just always gone and kind of suffered through it or felt guilty or whatever. And she said, I just really appreciated permission to do it. And, of course, I wasn't giving anybody permission. I was just kind of saying what I needed. But that's very important with your students, is if you recognize that they're dealing with these introverted issues, is to recognize that there is some drain in situations, and that's okay. You know, extroverts get drained too. You know, you put an extrovert in a very quiet setting, sit them in the basement of a library by themselves to study for a test, their energy is going to go too. We all lose energy when we're in our parts that we're not very comfortable with. So recognizing that, yeah, it is draining to be social. It's draining to do the job search. It's draining to go to an interview. So how are you going to reward yourself or treat yourself after that? And help them rediscover that buried treasure that's inside. You know, what are the parts of them that they might have lost over the years because they've felt such a need to be social? That happens a lot in families that are extroverted, and there's one child in the family that's kind of the introvert. That child has just learned to go along and maybe considers themselves odd or different. And again, helping them understand that there's a gold mine in there. And so giving yourself or giving the student permission to be alone. And that's okay. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. And discovering where you experience flow. You know, if you're an extrovert, what are the things that put you into a flow mode? You know, what are the things that give you energy? And maybe after a hard day of work, your idea of energy is to go out with a bunch of friends and have a cocktail and just enjoy the evening. Maybe for an introvert, it might be, I might do that, but I'll only stay for an hour and then I'm going to go home. Or they may just say, I really need to go home. So it's figuring out where flow comes from and how you get into those moods and what's going to do that. And also, going back to that idea that this myth that all of America is extroverted. You know, there's a portion, but it's not as much as you might think. And so knowing that maybe people aren't as extroverted, because a lot of introverts feel nobody understands me. Oh, they wouldn't understand this. And the truth is, a lot of extroverts absolutely understand that. And there's a lot of kind of closet introverts out there who definitely understand it and just never had a chance to really give rise to that. This is a wonderful quote, I think, from Emerson: to be yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you into something else is the great accomplishment. I think that's just such a terrific quote in terms of just, you know, the idea that being able to hold your own when you're feeling pressure and when there are situations that pressure you into being something that you're not. So let me change the slide here. I'm sorry, I'm having just a little bit of computer problem. There we go. So I've got 10 tips for you for introverts in the job search. One is to be who you are, is help that introvert find out what their strengths are and promote those strengths. Be who you are. Don't try to be. No, you're not going to try to be someone else. Yes, you're going to try to exhibit enthusiasm and interest because that needs to happen. But you may also have to say to the employer, you know, I am really excited about this. I realize I may not sound like it because my friends tease me all the time that I'm quiet or I'm an introvert. But the truth is, this is really exciting to me, and here's how I would tackle this project. You know, they're going to have to use their words because their nonverbals may not show it. If you try to force them to look animated or smile too much, I think that will backfire. So they're going to need to use their words. Figuring out their strengths, making them aware of what their wonderful strengths are, working on your confidence, you know, how to be more confident in that setting, and how to, what are the things that are going to build up their positive feelings about themselves as they attack this job search. And paying attention and cleaning up your internal conversation. I like to call that, for me, I call it the ick factor. And what I mean by that is every time I have to extrovert myself, which is what I'm doing right now, for example, when I'm extroverting myself, I'm okay and I'm moving along, but I guarantee you when this is over, the ick factor will kick in and I'll go, oh, I can't believe I said that, or oh, why didn't I mention this? You know, I will just go through a list of things I could have, should have, would have done. And that happens to me on social media. I'm on Facebook, and my professional page on Facebook is all about my book. My personal one's more about music and my hobbies and things. And every now and then I'll post something, and about an hour later the ick factor will come in. I'm like, oh, I can't believe I posted that, and I'll quickly run back and take it down. And of course it won't be anything bad. I know better than to do that. Anybody who heard the social media program 2 weeks ago knows that. But it's just, we all have our comfort zones. And so doing this program, and I love doing these programs, I'm just sorry I can't see you all and talk to you all, because that would be more fun. But doing these programs is fun for me, and I enjoy it. But at the same time, there's going to be a point where, okay, that's enough. And so it's that ick factor. You've got to help them over that internal conversation where they come back after the interview and, oh my God, the interview was terrible. I can't believe I did that. I said this, I did that. You know, they're probably going to do that. So rehearsal and preparation, mock interviews, any way that you can help them get ready for this search is really good. And once again, my computer is, for some reason, it's thinking. Okay, here we go. So the final of the 10 tips. Tip number 6, remember that most interviews are one-to-one, and that's usually a strength for introverts. So reminding them of that introverts are usually very good at one-on-one conversations. That's the kind of friendships they have. So letting them think about it as a relationship and developing a friend, having a good conversation. Also, I'm particularly fussy about thank you notes for introverts, and the reason for that is the thank you note gives them a chance to convey more enthusiasm in writing that they might not have been able to convey as well in person. So a thank you note where the other thing that happens with introverts is you're in a situation like a job interview, and you get out of it, and 5 minutes later you're like, oh, why didn't I tell them that? You know, or this would have been a much better answer to that question. So the thank you note gives you the opportunity to say, oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention. So a thank you note, I think, is particularly important, or thank you email, of course, I think is particularly important for introverts. And then another thing is, if you have a way to do this, getting them to practice with a small group, particularly if they're going to have interviews that are group interviews, and helping them do things like make eye contact with everybody in the group when they're telling a story or when they're saying something, getting them comfortable with that small group. Because again, it's all about that stimulus, and when too much, it's where's their line? Where's the line of I'm now overstimulated, and now my limbic system's going to kick in. And so that's what you're monitoring all the time, is that relationship with the cortex and the limbic system. How can I get that self-soothing cortex to get in there and say, it's okay, there's 7 people in the room, and you're going to pretend you're just talking to each one at a time. You know, that's how the cortex will help soothe. Social networking is your friend. It is the friend of introverts, because many introverts actually like social networking. They can send a tweet out, they can do Facebook, they can do LinkedIn. Those are ways that they can put their credentials out there, put their ideas and thoughts and things, and not have to physically be present to do that. And then reminding them that they've already learned to extrovert in a variety of settings. They've had to do it since they were little. Whether they liked it or not, they have had to do it. And it also helps to remind them that extroverts have to introvert too. So they know what that's like, to have to put on kind of a face that, anytime you take an extrovert and you put them in a very quiet setting where they have to be quiet for an hour, that's hard, and you're forcing them to introvert. Well, it's the same way the other way. So we all have to do that to a certain extent. So letting them know that it's not a big problem. It's not an awful thing. I love this quote from a writer, Douglas Adams. He says, the difficulty with this conversation is that it's very different from most of the ones I've had lately, which have mostly been with trees. You know, introverts will talk to all kinds of inanimate objects and animals as well. You know, introverts actually have great conversations with their cats and their dogs. And so to say that they're not good conversationalists just is not, again, that's a myth. It's inaccurate. It's just that people kind of mess with them, and whereas trees are pretty easy to talk to. So I just find that kind of humorous, the idea that, introverts have these wonderful conversations with bushes and trees and other things. So some sort of final thoughts. it is really important for introverts to be themselves and express their deepest interests and concerns, and getting them to tell you what their deepest interests are so they get comfortable talking about them so they can tell an employer about it, particularly if their interests are related to the job. And then helping them find that hidden power is a key to their success. You know, once again, being able to say, these are my strengths and these are the 3 points I want to get across in this interview. That's just getting them so that that cortex takes over the brain in the interview setting rather than the limbic system that just says, let's get out of this office as fast as humanly possible. And open their minds to this idea that they have control over their personality, and they can adapt when they need to. And again, like I said earlier, that others adapt too. They're not the only ones having to change. Extroverts have to change too in certain environments, and that's very important because it goes back to that original quote of why do I have to change, or do I have to be something that I'm not? Well, you know what? We all are something that we're not. We all have a face. What's it, the line, something about the face to meet the faces that you meet? You know, we all put a face on in different situations. So it's no different. It's social grace. It's what you do. So in case you want to learn more, I certainly have told you a million times about this book, Quiet, and I really can't recommend it enough. It's so interesting to read, and I tell you, I have a lot of extroverted friends that I've loaned it to, and they've loved it as well, because it's helped them understand these strange people that they're friends with, and their spouses and other people. It's just, you know, there's so many, again, myths and misconceptions, and I really like the way Susan Cain explains it. There's also a very nice book called Introvert Power by Lori Helgo, and that one has some very nice tips in it for job search and all of that. And then finally, there's the Introvert Advantage, how to thrive in an extrovert world. And I like that phrase, thrive, rather than just survive or cope, because I think so many students are at that, I'm just going to survive, I'm just going to cope, and so on. It's nice to think about how to thrive. So if you're thinking about doing a workshop, you know, for introverts, and I would use the term introvert rather than shy or social anxiety, because as I said, those names tend to go further on a spectrum than I think you want to go. So having a workshop called, you know, Introverts, how to thrive in the job search, you know, or how to tap into your power, you know, using those kinds of words I think can be really helpful. So on that note, I know that for you all, it's your lunch hour, and we're at about, I've got about, well, 12:47 your time, so I'm sure some of you would like to capture a few minutes of your lunch hour. But also now we can open it up, I think, to questions, and so I'm going to hope that Kate Alder is back on the phone and can figure out this system for me.
Hi, Kate Brooks. Yes, this is Kate Alder back, and I don't have any questions. No one's posted any questions. You did such a great job of explaining everything. I'm just going to open up Rita's microphone here too. Rita, did you have any comments or questions?
No, I just want to thank Kate. You know, it strikes me that you're really giving us what we need as the background for any kind of workshops we want to offer this. What I'm going to do is post that 10 tips for extroverts in the job search just on Ning for those that weren't able to come to the webinar.
Please do. And I've written probably 3 or 4 blogs on this topic, and Rita, I'll send you the links to those. And then if you want to put those links up, you can do that as well.
And I'll post that. But I really want to thank you, because in this day and age, it's harder and harder to get, you know, professional development, you know, under our belt, and you've just given us just a wealth of information that we could use in workshops. So thank you, Kate. I really appreciate it.
Kate, I do have a couple of questions and comments that got posted. First, I have a comment from Maureen White at the Chancellor's office. She wants both you and I to know that she's an ambivert, A-M-B-I-V-E-R-T.
Ambiverts are very, that's a relatively new term.
Yeah, she says, I know when to be an extrovert and when to be quiet.
That's right. And, you know, that might be I love that. That might be a really positive way to frame this for introverts, to say, you know what, we're going to make you an ambivert, you know, and you could even say that to extroverts as well. And
they're more skilled at being quiet because they already do it naturally, right? I do have a question from Amanda Barnett. She wants to know, you mentioned the ick factor. How would you recommend we help students overcome that?
You know, the ick factor, it's a challenge because I think it comes from sort of a sense of shame or embarrassment. I think that's where it comes from, of, oh my goodness, I've revealed too much about myself. And some of that comes after a while with just practice and being able to to really think about what am I comfortable telling people and what am I not as comfortable telling people. And being kind of that self-compassion needs to come in there. That's where you teach people to take a breath and to kind of say, can I just sit with that ick feeling for a minute and just be okay? And, you know, in the same way that if a friend said something or posted something, you would say to them, oh, don't be silly, nobody even read it, or nobody even heard that, or nobody remembers it. And that's probably true. And you have to be able to say that to yourself. So I think self-compassion, taking a breath, and practicing being compassionate to yourself. Because the ick statement is kind of a, you were bad, you know, you did something wrong. And that's just something to correct, I think.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Betty Thomas has another question. She has a student who isn't getting the information he needs at work and doesn't ask when he doesn't know something. He just stays quiet. She wants to know, how can she help this quiet student speak up in the workplace to ask the questions when he doesn't understand something?
That's a great question. I think what I would find out is to get a scan of the environment in which that happens. Like, is it at a meeting and the person doesn't want to just speak up, or is it just a one-on-one situation with a supervisor? And if that's the case, if it were in a meeting situation, I would say, well, probably don't speak up at the meeting because that might be too overwhelming. But select a kind person. You know, look for a friendly person that you can go up and say, you know, I'm not sure I understood this. Can you help me? Most people are not going to say no when you phrase it like, can you help me? And then if it's a supervisor, then I think the way to approach it is to sort of say, you know, is to start with a positive, with a compliment of, I'm really enjoying working here. I'm really curious and I want to learn more. And this is something I'm not quite getting. Can you help me? Again, that's how I would approach, because it's, you know, it's again, you're not necessarily admitting that you don't know things, but at the same time, you're trying to get them into a conversation.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming up, so I'm just going to take the screen back from you for a second, Kate, and I want to let everybody know, just a quick reminder, that the recording of this webinar will be available for you on the I'm sorry, I'm stumbling here because I was trying to get to the slide real quickly. So will be available for you on the Career Briefs website. So if you go to cacareerbriefs.com, at the bottom right corner of that homepage, you'll see the link for the Career Development Advisory. This webinar, as well as all the other webinars, are posted there. This one will be up in just a few day or two. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email kalder@ivc.edu. And I thank you all for your time. Have a great day.